Shalom, everybody, and a shout from around the world. I see a shout out from blistering cold Chicago, where I am today. I'm at the ARJE, which is the Reform Movement's Jewish Educators Conference, where I'm doing some teaching as well. But so excited to step out of the hustle and bustle of this morning in Chicago and join you and study a little Torah for a little bit. This week's parashah is Vaera, and let me set the stage, a little context, and then tell you what text we're going to look at and what we're going to think about today. We, of course, last week began the book of Exodus, and the Israelites are in servitude in Egypt and are about to be, spoiler alert, redeemed by God and Moses and Aaron and a whole bunch of others. We'll see the details as we're going. Last week, of course, we learned about the slavery. Moses gets a call to leadership from God. There's a first attempt to convince Pharaoh to let the people go, which will continue in this week's Parsha. The plagues are coming this week and next week. It's an exciting time. There are some sections that, there are those weeks where it feels like there's 6 weeks or where we're building the tabernacle and there's lots of archaeological details. And I wish those were condensed into fewer parshiot, and this parsha was spread out longer because there's so many great stories. Anyways, at the end of last week, Moses went to last week's parsha. Moses went to Pharaoh and said, I'm here for God, and Pharaoh, you should let the people go and serve God for a holiday in the desert. And Pharaoh says, not only I won't let that happen, I'm going to increase the burden. I'm no longer giving folks straw. You guys have to collect your own materials to make the bricks you have to make. And the Israelites say to Moses, you tried to help us out here, but you actually made things worse. And we sort of ended on a low point where it didn't seem like the Exodus was possible, and the people weren't happy with Moses, their leader, a theme that will continue throughout the Torah in one way or another. And this week we start by rebooting an effort to convince Pharaoh to let the people go and serve God instead of Pharaoh. Today we're going to look at the first few verses of the Parsha. The first thing we're going to start by looking at the JPS 1985 translation, which I'm going to put up on the screen in a moment for you. But let me tell you what I'm going to ask you to do. I want us to look at the first verses. I'll read them for you. You can, in a minute, I'll do this right now. I'm putting a link in the chat if you want to open the slides I'm going to share in a minute. Just went into the chat. I'm going to show it to you on your screen. I know some people like to open it on their own. The question, the task for all of us, while I show you these opening verses and read them to you, is to look carefully and critically at the words of the Torah that begin this week's Parsha. And if there are passages that are unclear or questions that these verses raise for you, put those comments and questions in the chat, and we'll see what those of us gathered today have to say in response to these first verses. So I'm going to share my screen. And here we go. I found the right one. And I'm going to start the slideshow. So these are the opening verses of the Parsha. I want you to look at the text here, and in the chat, share what comments, questions come to mind. What are you curious about based on what it says here? So the Parsha opens, God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name. Right, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the name of God we don't pronounce. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they lived as sojourners. I have now heard the moanings of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. This speech continues a little bit, but just want to know, what are you curious about here? What questions come up? And I want to see what we got. Here we go. Rob Plass says, why did it take centuries to hear the moaning? What changed now that now God could hear the cry? Great, a theological question, Rob, a really good one, right? What is it? Why does right this verse says like God, didn't remember before, now remembers? What took so long? What brought this up? There could be questions here about God and God's capacity to remember. There could be questions here about, why remembering now. Nice. There's a question about what's the meaning of El Shaddai, right? There's the name of God, El Shaddai. There's the name of God here, Yud He Vav He, which sometimes they translate right here as the Lord, all caps. What are the different names of God? What do they mean? Nice. How the Avot knew and called upon his name, but didn't know Hashem by name. Right? What is this about what name people knew God by? And what does that look like and why? I love all these questions. Nice. All right. So I see these great questions you're putting in the chat. I gave people a minute to do it. I will say I'm in that same camp of you about a few things. One is, what is this notion about? I want to focus on two of these questions that you guys raised. One is, what's this notion about knowing God by different names? I want to look at the language here, particularly in that it's the second verse on the page, right? God says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? Here's this weird question of God appeared with one name and God hid another name. We don't necessarily see that. We see God referred to as different names in Genesis, but it seems here there's some intentionality on God's part about what name God used with the patriarchs, and now starts using a new name. There's a question about that. And then there's the issue in the last verse about now I heard that God says, I heard the moaning of the Israelites, and now I have remembered my covenant. What's that all about? Excellent. I love that we saw that. I'm going to flip to the next slide in a second, but let me tell you about what's on it. You're looking at right now the Jewish Publication Society translation from 1985. The original Jewish Publication Society translation, I think, was 1917. They updated it in 1985, and there's actually a new one from 2006 that tried to update 1985 to be a little more inclusive about gender and God language. I picked 19. They're all good in their own way. I picked this one to start with. The next slide is going to show you these same verses from the Shotgun translation of the Torah, which was done by Everett Fox, who's a Bible professor. So take a moment to just take in these verses from JPS 1985, and I'm going to show you the Shotgun version, which came out in 1995. And the question I have for you as we see those verses is, what's different about what we're going to see in the verses that are coming in the next translation? All right, here we go. I'm changing the slide and moving a quick zoom window that I have that's blocking the words. So here we go. Same verses. This is Everett Fox's translation published by Shotgun. God spoke to Moshe and said to him, I am Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? Why? That's the name of God we don't pronounce. Same thing you just hear in the English letters, not the Hebrew. I was seen by Abraham, by Yitzchak, and by Yaakov as God Shaddai, but by my name, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, I was not known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their sojournings, where they had sojourned. And I have also heard the moanings of the children of Israel, whom Egypt is holding in servitude, and I have called to mind my covenant. So in a minute, we'll look at some of these things side by side. But if you notice some differences that matter to what here, what do you see in these new verses? And if you can feel free to throw into the chat what that might be. Seeing some characteristics coming in and more questions. Nice. So there are lots of questions coming in about God and God's concept of time. Nice. Some nice things coming in the chat. Keep following along there. I want to highlight some of these differences side by side that we see and reflect a little bit about on what that might do to the meaning of the text. So here we go. Here's number one. This is with the issue of God's name. So some of you had questions about what are the different names of God? What do each mean? Someone hinted at different names of God might have different attributes. Right, there are dozens of names of God in the Hebrew Bible that are used. Right, the rabbis talk about some that different names have different connotations, and you can learn a lot, like metaphorically or literarily, from what name of God is used and what mood or emotion or how God's going to show up based on what God is there. There are lots of writing about that. That's a topic for a different day. What I want to focus on here is the way these two translations deal with this issue of the names and how they were used. If you look at what's highlighted in yellow, JPS, in laying out this translation, says, I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my other name. Right? What's it's sort of active voice here. All right, left one thing not highlighted yet. Right? God appeared, and God appeared with one name and did not make myself known by the other name. There's some implication that God hid the other name, maybe, right? God had this other name that God could have made God's self known by that name, but God did not. As opposed to in the Shochan piece, it says here, I was seen by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So instead of God appeared to, this says I was seen by, right? It's a passive voice, but the people who are active, who are doing the seeing here, right? The active people are Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the patriarchs, and they saw God as God Shaddai, El Shaddai. But by God's name, Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh, right, I was not known to them. Right, who's active here is a little different. The first one is sort of God focused. The second one is sort of people focused. And for me, this is a significant difference in the translation of the verse. I will say the particular form of the Hebrew verb here, like make myself known to or known by them, it's an odd formulation. The medieval biblical commentators have a lot to say about what form the verb was in and what it means in this context. It's not a common usage. So the fact that there's some different translations reflects that a long history of talking about this word in this verse. But if we're looking at these two things, they take us to very different places about what this verse means. And here is my journey through this from one to the other. I read the first verse and said, like, it ascribes certain things to God that made me ask all these questions, right? God appeared with one name to the patriarchs and kept another name that God is now starting to use, right? Because the verse right before this says, right, I am Yud-Heh, Vav-Heh. God announces a new name in Exodus and the verse right before this. And it made me start to ask, like, well, why would God use one name before and change? Why did God, it seem, hide one of the names? And it raised a lot of questions about God and God's motivation, about how God introduced God's self in the patriarchal era, in the patriarchal stories, and now here in the Exodus story. What are those differences and what do we make of them? And I was puzzled by that a little bit, but then I peeked at this other translation where the difference is not about God's choice about how to make God made God's self known, but the difference, as implied by the Shochan translation, was that this was how God was perceived. That Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in their day perceived God one way and named God Shaddai, El Shaddai. And there's this other name that wasn't the way that they interacted with God. They didn't discover it or they didn't know it. It wasn't in their perspective. That now is sort of emerging in God's relationship with the Israelites later. And to a certain extent, for me anyways, from shifting from this one translation to the other translation and thinking about this verb and what it means, it shifted it shifted what I was thinking about from why would God be invested in what name? Why would God choose one name and not the other? To this notion that different people at different times perceive God differently. And the patriarchs in their era might have connected with God in one way and built a relationship in one way as embedded, and from that came a particular name. And as the book of Exodus opens, where there's going to be now a relationship between God and a people, not just God and immediate family, the nature of that relationship changes, and then the way in which they describe it and name it changes. So the Everett Fox, the Shotgun translation, for me, takes away some of the questions I had about the verse, about God and God's motivation, and instead shed light on some insight about how we, in different times and different eras of different people, look at our relationship with God differently. And I guess what comes out of this for me, and we'll see one more example of this in a second, is that the way in which a verse is interpreted, or here the way in which a verse is translated, can lead to far different implications about what the text mean, what questions we think about, what discussion we even want to start to have about one passage or another. And we can do the same thing with this verse at the end about God hearing the suffering of the Israelites, right? JPS said, "I have now heard the moaning of the Israelites because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage." A number of you pointed this out in the chat before. Why did God hear now and not before? Whereas in the Shotgun translation, it says, "I have also heard the moaning of the children in Egypt." Doesn't it seem, the first one sort of says for God didn't hear and now God hears, but now this in the Shotgun translation, I can flip back a slide in a second, or you can flip back a slide. Like, I've also heard this also sort of adds to the list before, meaning I knew, I had a relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now I'm, that relationship is continuing. And I also hear that right now that their descendants are suffering. But as opposed to the now, the also gives this notion of just God mentioning that God recognizes that there's suffering and there's moaning that God is aware of and hears, where the first translation, the JPS one, seems to imply God didn't hear and now God hears. For me, also about this word, right, in JPS, it raised all these questions, which are good ones to ask, like why now? Why did God hear now? Why not before? Doesn't God hear all the time? What does it mean for God to turn off hearing? And then to turn on. But the second translation sort of says, right, God is mentioning, I've also heard, noting this, but not necessarily a time-bound nature to when God heard and when God didn't hear. Same thing also with the end phrase about memory. The first one says, right, I heard the suffering and then I remembered, right, my covenant. Somehow the suffering, God now hears the suffering, and somehow that triggers a reminder that there's a covenant with the ancestors of these people that God's not going to act on. As opposed to the second verse that says, right, I also heard the suffering, and hearing the suffering, I've called to mind my covenant. Doesn't mean that, right? To me, anyways, the called to mind term instead of remembering sort of says like this became front and center. Like, it's not that God didn't remember the covenant and now God is remembering the covenant, but God knew about the covenant, and in this moment of suffering, God makes the decision to act on it, right? Brings it to the front of mind, called it to mind, which to me has a little different nuance than remembered. This, for me, anyways, the second translation from Shotgun fits in a little more. It raises fewer theological issues about God and God's attributes and God's engagement with people. I still have questions about that because I think the way the Bible thinks about how God interacts in the world is not how we think about it today. But within that setting, there's, I think, a very different nuance between the first translation and the second translation, and together those make a whole different read of the initial verses of this week Parashat. I'm going to stop sharing in a minute and come back to you. All that being said, I see that as I was talking, we're up to close to 50 new messages text that I haven't followed. I hope my trusty host today might be able to call out some of those comments in a minute. What I wanted to point out is the following about this. We're lucky. We live in an age where we have lots of tools to access the biblical text and lots of ways to study. If you have some Hebrew in your background, a next step in this exercise could be, let's look at each of these translations and compare it back to the original Hebrew and think about the choices that the translators made and how we think of the Hebrew language, and which ones we think are better or more accurate or more true to the original text. If you have Hebrew, you're able to do that. If you don't have Hebrew, that's harder to do. But what we do have and at our fingertips is access not just to these two translations, but access to lots of different translations. Right? If you're if you're part of an English-speaking society, like there's a whole world of those. And actually, I'm going to go back and share my screen for a second. Just many of you might know about this, but I'm going to. I lost. Hang on. Oh, I know it's covering here. Just flipping to this other screen. I hope you are in one way or another. Oh, there we go. Familiar with Safaria.org, which is an online Jewish library that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger every day. And just in case, pardon me, for those who are familiar with this, please pardon me as I introduce it to those who are not. So first, you should know on the opening page, right, there's a menu here that links to all kinds of different texts. Tanakh is the Hebrew Bible that's here, but even if you open it on the right side of the screen down, it gives you a link straight to the weekly portion. So if you don't want to search or have to find it, it's in like their menu. So if you pull up this week's Torah portion, mine comes up immediately with Hebrew and English, and you can change your screen. If you join and set up your own account, you could log on in different ways. But here's what I wanted to show you. Within this, if you could see my mouse over here, there are 23 different translations on this site available to look at a particular verse. So not only, right, do you have access to the commentaries, the traditional commentaries on the Torah in Sefaria, many of which, not all, are translated in English, but here there are 23 translations, 12 of them are in English from various sources and various times that you have on the side. And I think there's some Spanish, French, Russian, and German if you're a multilingual, Persian as well. Ooh, that's new. I haven't seen the Persian one there before. So if you are multilingual, you might be able to compare how is this, how is this verse translated 3 ways into English and 1 way into Polish to help you look at the text. Each of these translations in their own way are a commentary. And each of these translations give you a different insight to different ways to read the text. And an exercise that you might do if you're a regular student of the weekly Torah portion is to think about either rotating which translation you use in a given week, or picking the translation you like, but when you find a verse that raises lots of questions for you to say, I wonder how some of the other translations deal with they translate this verse and what they raise. And sometimes by putting up in your window on your computer 3 different translations next to each other, you can see that the questions that you have or the thing that you notice at the verse or the oddity that caused you to say, hey, what's going on here? The translators are noticing and dealing with by translating the text in 3 different ways. It can open up and unlock a whole vision of what's happening in the Torah just by using the various ways that different translators have dealt with the verse and what that implies about what the text means. Today we saw some different understandings of God's motivation, how God acts in the world that lead us in different directions based on some of the questions that you raised. And I hope in this small way that opened up your thinking to the complexity of what's in the Torah and what's there. And sometimes the limitation of sticking to just one commentator or one translation that has a particular bias about how they approach particular issues of theology or questions of things. And then you have options to compare. And with the tools we have online, you could do a lot of that digging in and study on your own, because Sefaria and other sources as well have made this available. Right now, I notice that as I wrapped up that point, another 20 new comments in the chat that I haven't been able to follow. My biggest regret about when I come and I get to teach is I don't get to engage in all that learning in the chat, which is always so awesome. But Zoom saves
it really is.
Later. So what can you help me, Mara, find?
Yeah, I want to know, thank you so much for sort of digging into this translation question. And I promise everyone I did not plant this teaching today, but I do want to note that in addition to Sefaria, looking at all these different translations to get a deeper picture of the text, learning the Hebrew is also really helpful. Next week, we are going to be joined by Professor Natasha Shabbat, who I believe is actually here. And she is a teacher of biblical Hebrew. We are also going to be putting on a course on biblical Hebrew. So that was an aside. So in terms of the chat, I do invite folks to raise their hand if they are so, if they'd like. But in terms of trying to give a synopsis of these, I think, hundreds of messages, we have some notes of biblical criticism of like, what does it mean that we use this name here and that name here, and what are the writers saying when we're using this name versus that name. And I'll invite you to share however much you want to on that, Rabbi. But I think it was Jay also said, is El Shaddai the roots that are on the mezuzah? And I hadn't heard that before, so I wasn't sure if you could speak to that and how it may relate to things that are in our home.
Yeah. So Shaddai is a name of God, often connected. The El Shaddai comes like with El Shaddai. El is some ways a generic. Well, both in the ancient Middle East, El is a name that connects to God or gods in not outside of Israelite society. El Shaddai often comes together. Shaddai is often thought of as a more personal, intimate God. As we saw in what we looked at today, right? If Abraham, who's direct personal connection to God, different from God with the people as a whole, but you get some of the intimacy maybe that the patriarchs had, that's where that connection to that name of God comes from. And from the statement today that God says, that's how they knew me then with this name, right? It reflects that intimate, individual relationship. And it's a tradition to put Shaddai on your mezuzah, or even you write the word Shaddai on the back of the parchment, right? There's a biblical passage inside the mezuzah, and on the back where the words are mostly not there, the word Shaddai is written. And some mezuzot actually have a little glass window, so when the parchment is wrapped up, you can see through the little window to the word Shaddai. And the notion there is like, right, if you have a close personal relationship with God, when you're related to God in that way, God's going to provide some protection to your home. And the placing of Shaddai in the mezuzah goes with some of the themes of mezuzah, where people thought of it as a way of not just bringing God's presence into the home, and not just to fulfill the mitzvah of having Torah all around us all the time, including on our doorposts, but to invoke our connection with God for some sort of protection. We see that from, right, the use of that name of God in that ritual that's here. But I see someone's putting here, right, the acronym. It's not clear what order it is as that came, right? The Shaddai, it happens, is an acronym for Shomer Dlatot Yisrael, like that God is the guardian of the doors of Israel. If you ask me, it's someone came up with that acronym after the tradition of putting this name on the door because it fits. Like a good creative, it's a good poetic literary thing that says, oh, we have these words, and guess what? It's like has door and God and the business of door, it all fits together. It's a lovely tradition there. So thank you for that comment. But also say, as I skimmed a little bit here, I see a lot of people who are suggesting their favorite translations, which is awesome. We're crowdsourcing what translation you might like. And I also saw in the commentary like some great information that people are sharing, like about this JPS is easier to read, and the shocking translation is closer to the style of the Hebrew text. I agree with both of those assessments, and I'm sure the crowdsourcing I think will work about this. Some people like some of the translations based on their ease of access. Some people like it based on their commitment to preserve, in English as much of the style of the Hebrew text as you can when you switch languages. For me in my work as a teacher, I have different go-to translations depending on what I'm teaching, or if I'm doing some research, depending what I need. There are things I could depend on JPS for, and other things I could depend on Everett Fox for, and having the menu of them, being able to flip between them on my computer is also easier than like taking that whole. Many of these I have on my actual bookshelf. My kids know something's up when like I have 7 of my Hebrew translations out open and I'm trying to compare them. It's much easier to do now online, and saves the cleanup afterwards. I just like close on the screen. But anyways, I'm glad people have favorites. I feel like it's a good sign of commitment to Torah study if you have a favorite translation. So if you don't have one yet, I challenge you to find one that you love and make it your favorite and make it your own. And then once you do, like to mix it up a little bit and look at some of the other stuff. All right, let me pause and see if there's someone who wants to jump in with a question or another theme that Mara has for us to
Great.
think about.
Someone's asking, when does this event happen? But I'm not quite sure which event we're referring to. But maybe you have a clear idea, Rabbi.
What period of history? So I don't. If we're talking about don't know which event. The biblical narrative, in the biblical narrative in this week's parsha, in this week's portion, we're right at the end of the period of Israelite slavery in Egypt. So that's where the story comes from today. I mean, most of the translations that we're talking about I think translations of the Torah go back to the translating of the Hebrew Bible into Greek and Latin. That goes way back to the ancient period. Many of the translations that we talked about today are within the last 1,500 years as well. I see people, there are different theories about the dating, and some people are chiming in about that, about the dating of the biblical narrative, on our calendar. Personally, looking at the biblical narrative of biblical history, I put it more in the category of national. This is our founding narrative, and to me, to a sense, it's timeless. While there are ways, either by the biblical record, you could try to account for how to put it on the timeline in the Jewish counting of years, or compare that to the secular piece. I think this is the Torah tells the story of our mythic past more than our historical past, and for me, anyways, the question of how and when to date this is more of a moot one. That our sense that we come, we have a tradition as a people that we come from slavery into freedom, and instead of serving the pharaoh of a great empire, we should serve God, and that's what drives me and motivates me Jewishly, as opposed to our ability to line up our understanding of history with our understanding of biblical history. But that might be for a topic for another day in another class, but I see that. well.
Great. There's some folks who are asking for some additional Rashi commentary on the names or something. Any insights he may have on this parsha, but if you don't have that handy, that's completely
I
fair.
looked at some of the Rashi today, and some of the Midrash. Rashi refers to some of the Midrashim. But
Also, can we give a brief description of who Rashi is?
Sure. Um, um, in the Middle Ages, throughout Europe, right, both within the Christian Europe and Muslim North Africa and Northern and Muslim Europe, when there was a flourishing of all kinds of biblical commentators. Rashi, who was French, is a prominent one. In addition to, I could go back to the Sefaria page, right? In addition to looking at like different ways that the translators treat the text, we could go back 1,000 years in history and look at the different ways that biblical commentators treat the text. There are some conversations in the commentators today about like the weird verb about how God made God's name known to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or how they noted, there's a weird grammatical formulation in the biblical Hebrew that the commentators take up a little bit, which is reflected in the translations that we saw. And there are some different older rabbinic sources that they refer back to in terms of thinking about what it means to be known by different names in different ways. I do have to say that I guess for me today in exploring that, I found more meaning in the noting the differences in like our modern commentators and our translators. I didn't find that the conversation about the different names in the traditional biblical commentators to be as compelling as looking at the difference between how Everett Fox dealt with it from the JPS translation. You might have a different opinion about that, but I didn't prepare a whole summary of those rabbinic commentators. I will say, if you go to sefaria.org and you click on the weekly portion and you find those verses, if you highlight any verse, it brings up a window that brings you two links to all the commentaries, right? It's a nice hyperlinked online source, and more and more of the traditional rabbinic and medieval commentators on Sefaria are translated into English. So you have access both to all these commentators yourself. If you want to peek on Sefaria for more than that. I'm sorry, I don't have a wider way to just access right now. You can look at it there. And then, of course, not only do we have the issue of there are different commentators who might interpret a verse in different ways, the translation issue comes up there as well. I don't think Sefaria has multiple translations of Rashi, but Rashi has been translated by different translators, and sometimes different translators, just like we translate the Bible differently, translate Rashi differently. And this issue of how do we come to understand what Rashi meant if we're translating Rashi into English might also depend upon what's there. And of course, I see someone commenting that the English translators can't give the English can't give the same sense as the Hebrew text. I think with any ancient text, with any text, any translate, whether it's modern literature or a novel, reading anything in its original language is much more direct connection to the person who put the text together in the original intent or the original work of the author. And once you translate, you're already in the realm of commentary. When we talk about Jewish sources, whether it's biblical Hebrew or Talmudic Aramaic, the challenge for many modern students of these texts is that many of us don't have these ancient languages and the skills in them. And while translation isn't the same as the original, translation can be a great doorway into studying these texts. And what I love about, and maybe this is some of my point today, the fact that there are multiple translations can at least give you a whole array when you look at them about what's going on in the Hebrew text. Because if you see 4 translations that look at a verse and do different things with it, it's probably a result of something that raises some questions or is open to interpretation in the original. And by comparing the translations back and forth, you can get a sense of some of the issues in studying that.
Thank you so much for sort of walking through the layers of translation, and I think that diving into that, it goes beyond this parsha specifically. But as we go into Shabbat, is there something that you think people can sort of take from this parsha as a snippet of wisdom?
I love that question. And actually, one meta comment first about that, like as I think about coming to the space, some weeks some weeks when I'm here, and others too, like my focus is like, what's in this parsha? What's the nugget I can take with me? What's interesting here? What questions come up? For those who were looking for that, I know I did less of that today in sort of trying to look at how we read the text and what we can glean from the translations. I think for me, both are part of the study of Torah. When I think about, there are a few things, I'll leave you with some questions to think about that we didn't touch on today, but this week's Parsha raises questions about, we start to see the process through which redemption from Egypt happened. The interactions between God, Moses, the people, Pharaoh, and the different motivations of the different characters and the way it goes. And there are lots of questions to chew on about what was the purpose of the plagues? Why do we need them? Is that justifiable, right? I have lots of questions asked, like, was this the only way? Like, how much did the Egyptians really have to suffer? Is it required for them to suffer in order is that good for them? Is it good for the Israelites? Looking at Pharaoh and Pharaoh's motivations, and when Pharaoh has free choice, and when God may or may not, or seems to limit Pharaoh's choice, and what the consequences are. There's a lot of that juicy stuff in the Parsha. I was drawn to something else this week, but there are all those things to look at. There's a lot here also. I know it's like January and we're about to celebrate Tu B'Shvat, but these stories are the ones we're going to talk about at the night of the Seder, months and months ahead. So I might give you this nugget. If you're studying this week's Parsha, this is a great time to take some notes about what you might want to talk about at your Seder when we come back to this story, even though then it's not Parshat Shavua. Like, later, sometimes I find when I'm cooking for Passover, I have less time to think about the learning at the Seder. I'm not cooking for Passover yet. It's a great time to read these texts and think about what are the themes here that you want to bring to your Seder table. Maybe that's an intention you can go into this Shabbat with. Anyways, I hope that did it for you and answered your question and gave you some nuggets to think about what's in the Parsha, at least some things to think about. Thanks everybody for being here, and I wish you a Shabbat Shalom. And,
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you all.
The peace we all need in all
week.
corners.
All right. Amen. Thank you.